My grandson passed away from a supposed drug-induced shock diagnosis. My daughter-in-law blamed her husband. Because of your pill, my son lost his life. She filed for divorce and took everything. Years later, the hospital called. We had the wrong file. Your grandson didn't die from a drug reaction. Someone injected poison into his IV line. We have the security footage where they showed me the killer's face. I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of vengeance from. I want to know how far it has reached. I was in the backyard garden. My hands were carefully trimming the dry branches of the rose bushes. For 7 years, this garden had been my refuge. It was the place where I found a little bit of peace in the middle of days that felt impossible to keep living through. The branches, though withered, still held a little life, just like me. Still here, still trying, even if it was just to keep existing. The phone rang inside the house. It was shrill, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced at the window, intending to ignore it. It was probably just another one of those pointless spam calls. But the ringing continued, insistent, as if trying to yank me out of my little corner of calm. I sighed, wiped my hands on my old, worn apron, and went inside. The phone screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated for a moment. My finger hovered over the decline button, but for some reason I couldn't explain. I ended up answering. Hello? Am I speaking with Mrs. Eleanor? The voice on the other end of the line was that of a young professional woman. Her tone was soft, but there was something unsettling about it, as if she was struggling to maintain her composure. Yes, that's me, I replied, my voice a little husky. It had been a long time since anyone had called me, except for a few old friends checking in. What is this about? I'm calling from the office of St. Jude Hospital. Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds needs to speak with you. The name St. Jude pierced my chest like a sharp knife. I stood still, gripping the phone tightly, feeling the ground beneath my feet shift. St. Jude Hospital. That place I had promised never to return to. Not since that day. The day my world fell apart. The day Ethan, my only grandson, left and never came back. 7 years had passed since then, as I tried to bury the memories of those white hallways, the strong smell of disinfectant and the sound of my own sobs in the darkness. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice from trembling. Is something wrong? All the bills have already been paid. I haven't had anything to do with the hospital for a long time. The girl on the other end hesitated, choosing her words very carefully. It's not about that, Ma'am. It's about something related to Ethan's file. I dropped the pruning shears I held in my other hand. The sound of the metal hitting the ground was dry, like a warning. Ethan. 7 years without anyone speaking his name. That name was a wound that never healed. Just touching it was enough to bring unbearable pain. Ethan's file? I repeated, my voice cracking. What file? That was settled a long time ago. I am so sorry, Ma'am, the young woman said, lowering her voice. I don't have any more information. Dr. Reynolds said it's an important matter. Could you come to the hospital today? I don't remember what I replied. I just know that a few minutes later I was sitting in a taxi, my hands clasped together to stop them from shaking. The scenery outside the window blurred past like an old, fuzzy movie. I wasn't looking at it. In my mind, there was only Ethan. His big eyes, his innocent smile with that little cleft in his lip. He was only a few months old, so tiny I could hold him in my arms, and yet he was gone, leaving me with a void that was impossible to fill. When the taxi stopped in front of the doors of St. Jude Hospital, I almost didn't dare to get out. The smell of disinfectant hit me as soon as I opened the door, bringing with it all the memories of that fateful night. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. The hallway was the same as before: white walls, shiny floors, and those cold directional signs. I walked past the reception desk, avoiding the curious gaze of the clerk. "Where is Dr. Reynolds' office?" I asked in a dry voice. She showed me the way, and I walked, step by step, as if every movement weighed a stone. Dr. Geoffrey Reynolds was waiting for me in a small, tidy room. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that were, however, weighed down by a hard-to-describe sadness. He stood up when he saw me, smiled slightly, and invited me to sit down. "Mrs. Eleanor, thank you for coming," he said in a warm voice. He pushed a glass of water toward me, as if he knew I needed something to hold on to. I took it, but didn't drink, just squeezed it in my hands, feeling the cold seep into my fingers. He sat down again, his face serious. "Mrs. Eleanor, we apologize for bothering you after so many years," he began, speaking slowly, as if weighing every word. "Lately, the hospital has been digitizing all the old files. A technician happened to review the security footage from the intensive care unit from the night little Ethan passed away." I felt my heart sink. "Security footage?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "What footage? My grandson?" "The doctor said it was a reaction to the medication. I don't understand." Dr. Reynolds looked me straight in the eye. In his gaze there was sincerity, but also a deep pain. The report concluded that the boy did not recover due to a severe reaction to the medication. "But ma'am, that is not the whole truth." Those words struck me in the chest. I opened my mouth, but couldn't make a sound. The whole truth? What did he mean by that? For 7 years, I had lived with the pain of thinking that Ethan had died because of a medical accident, something unavoidable. I had convinced myself it was fate. And now, Dr. Reynolds was telling me there was another truth. He turned the computer screen toward me and pressed a few keys. "The quality of this recording is very poor," he explained. 7 years ago, technology didn't allow us to see clearly, but now it's different. We used a restoration program to enhance the image. A blurry video appeared on the screen, with the faint light of the hallway seeping through the door. I immediately recognized the corner of the room, the intensive care unit, where Ethan had spent his last night. The boy, so small, lost among the hospital sheets, with the IV connected to his tiny arm. I felt my eyes burn, but I didn't dare to blink, afraid of missing any detail. A figure appeared in the recording, dressed in a nurse's uniform, walking quickly but carefully. It was early morning. The hallway was almost empty, with only a few nurses in the background. That person stopped next to Ethan's bed, looked around, making sure no one was watching. Then, in a movement so quick I could barely make it out, they took a syringe from their pocket and connected it to the IV tube. A clear liquid was injected. The whole thing lasted just a few seconds. Precise, cold. Afterward, the figure moved away and disappeared into the shadows, as if they had never been there. I held my breath, clutching the glass so tightly I thought it would break. "Who? Who is that person?" I whispered, my voice cracked. But deep down, I already feared the answer. Dr. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He pressed a button and zoomed in on the image just as the person turned their head toward the camera. The image was grainy, but the program had restored the features: high cheekbones, a delicate chin, and cold, emotionless eyes. "We have confirmed the identity of this face," he said in a serious voice. "Look closely, ma'am." I looked and felt my heart stop. My throat closed up, as if an invisible hand was squeezing it hard. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to hold back the sob that wanted to escape. I couldn't mistake that face. My head spun with what I had just seen, involuntarily pulling me back to that terrifying memory from years ago. I still clearly remember the day Robert brought Julia home for the first time. It was a Sunday afternoon. The sun was streaming through the window, filling the living room with light. Robert arrived holding the hand of a young woman with bright eyes overflowing with happiness. "Mom, this is Julia," my son said, with an obvious pride in his voice. Julia stood there, in a simple white dress, her black hair loose, and a smile. Oh God, a smile that could melt the coldest winter. I looked at her and felt a joy that was hard to describe. My son is a lucky man, I thought. Julia greeted me respectfully. "Good afternoon, Mum." She handed me a basket with orchids carefully wrapped. The lilac petals trembled as if they were also saying hello. "Robert told me you like orchids," she said in a sweet voice with a bright look. I was touched, not only by the gift, but by her thoughtfulness. Robert had told me that Julia was a very capable marketing professional at the startup company where he worked. She was smart, shrewd, and most importantly, she loved my son. Seeing how Robert squeezed her hand, I knew I would soon have another daughter in the family. That meal was truly pleasant. Julia fit in surprisingly fast. She praised my turkey chili. She said it reminded her of her childhood family meals. She asked about my health. She shared some funny anecdotes from the meetings at Robert's company. She remembered the names of all the family members after a single introduction, from my niece Claire to little Johnny. When I accidentally spilled some iced tea on the tablecloth, I quickly apologized, but Julia reacted immediately, naturally dabbing the liquid with a napkin. "It's okay, Mum. It was just a little bit," she said softly, without losing her smile. Everything she did seemed right, as if she were born to make everything around her work well. I looked at Robert and saw how his eyes shone while watching her. I felt a warmth in my heart, as if we had found the missing piece in our home. That girl is wonderful, I thought. In that moment, I believed with all my heart that Julia would bring happiness to my son and our entire family. Months later, Robert proposed, and Julia accepted. The news arrived like a fresh breeze, filling the house with joy. Robert smiled more than ever. His voice sounded hopeful as he talked about their plans. Although his company was small, it was growing, and Julia was the brains behind the campaigns that made it stand out. I felt proud of my son and started to love Julia like a daughter. She called me often, asked about my health, and even brought me a jar of homemade strawberry jam, saying she had learned the recipe from her mother. But then, when they started planning the wedding, I began to notice the first signs. Julia was the main organizer and did everything with impressive meticulousness. She chose the venue, the menu, and even the color of the tablecloths herself. At first, I admired her dedication, but over time, I realized it wasn't just carefulness, it was control. Once, I suggested using white roses for the ceremony, the same ones my mother had chosen for her wedding, as a way to maintain the family tradition. Julia smiled, that sweet, familiar smile. But the next day, she came with a huge catalogue and pointed to the pictures of white lilies. "Aunt, lilies are more fashionable and look more elegant, don't you think?" she said in a soft tone, but leaving no room for discussion. I nodded, thinking I shouldn't interfere too much. After all, it was my daughter-in-law's big day. In the end, everything at the wedding was exactly as Julia wanted. From the invitations with gold lettering to the seating arrangement, everything had her touch. I tried not to dwell on it and told myself she just wanted everything to be perfect. But inside me, a strange feeling began to grow, slight but constant, like a small cloud in a clear sky. The wedding day arrived, and the small church my family used to attend was elegantly decorated. Julia, in her white gown, looked like a princess out of a fairy tale. Robert was by her side, in his fitted black suit, his eyes fixed on her. Sitting in the front row, I felt tears fall as I watched my son say his vows. "Mum, I'm so happy," Robert whispered to me before the ceremony began, and I squeezed his hand with a heart full of hope. But as the party continued, I went to the kitchen to thank the catering team, something I always did to make sure everyone felt appreciated. There, I heard a cold voice, sharp as a knife. "I asked for the appetizers to be arranged in a tower shape. Why are they on flat plates? Did you read my email or not?" It was Julia, in her impeccable wedding dress, but with no trace of sweetness on her face. Instead, she had a tense expression and a hard, almost punitive glare. The banquet manager, a nervous young man, apologized repeatedly, but Julia didn't stop. "This lack of professionalism is ruining my whole image," she hissed, with contained fury. I stood still, my heart pounding. I had never seen Julia like this, but as soon as she turned and saw me, her face changed completely, as if turning a page. The smile returned, sweet, charming. "Oh, Mom, you were looking for me. Isn't the party lovely?" she said cheerfully, gently placing a hand on my shoulder. I just nodded, smiling awkwardly, trying to shake off that feeling of unease. She must be stressed, I thought. Who doesn't want their wedding to be perfect? After the wedding, Robert asked me if they could live at home for a while, as his startup wasn't stable yet. "Mum, it'll just be for a little while, until we can buy our own place," he told me with eyes full of hope. I accepted without hesitation, happy to imagine my house filled with laughter and voices again. I dreamed of family meals, shared evenings, and maybe, someday, the sound of a child running through the hallways. But reality turned out to be very different from what I imagined. It all started very subtly, like a light breeze passing, but enough to make me feel uneasy. Julia came into the house with her usual smile, as sweet as the first day I met her. She said she wanted to clean and reorganize the house so the feng shui flows better. I don't know much about those things, but seeing her so enthusiastic, I didn't have the heart to say no. She replaced the cream-colored curtains I liked so much with grey ones, which were cold and austere. "Mum, these are more modern and minimalist. They match the house better," she told me in a soft but firm voice. I just nodded, thinking maybe I should let her do what she wanted. After all, this was my son's house too. But the changes didn't stop there. One morning, I walked into the living room and noticed that my wedding photo was no longer on the wall. It was a photo I adored, where my husband wore a slightly oversized suit and I smiled in a simple dress. In its place was an abstract painting full of lines that made no sense to me. I asked Julia, trying to remain calm, "Honey, where is my wedding picture?" She smiled, with that sweetness that was starting to make me uncomfortable. "Mum, that picture looks a little dated. I put it in the attic so the space looks more uncluttered. This painting is more modern, don't you think?" I didn't say anything, just nodded, but inside I felt heavy. That photo wasn't just an image, it was a part of my life, of the happy days with my husband. Now it was packed away in a box, as if it had no value anymore. One day I opened the refrigerator to get some water and saw a sheet of paper perfectly taped to the door. It was a list of house rules, printed and laminated as if it were an official document. The first few lines sounded reasonable. "Please take off your shoes before entering. Turn off the lights if you're not using them." I thought Julia just wanted to keep the house clean, but soon the list grew. "Do not eat after 9 o'clock in the evening. Separate dirty laundry by colour before washing. The weekly menu must be prepared every Sunday." I read all that and felt like I couldn't breathe. It was no longer my home, but a place that operated according to Julia's rules. One afternoon, I decided to cook the pulled pork barbecue that Robert had always loved since he was a kid. In the kitchen, I carefully cut the meat. I cooked the collard greens, and the aroma filled the house. I smiled, imagining my son's happy face when he tasted it. I put the pot on the table, eagerly awaiting his arrival. But Julia walked in, looked at the barbecue, and smiled. "Mom, this dish has too much fat," she said in a kind but firm voice. "I already prepared grilled chicken breast with quinoa salad for him. Please put the barbecue away." And she took the pot before I could say a word. When Robert arrived, he saw the chicken dish and smiled. "Mom, don't worry, she's just looking out for my health." But in his eyes, I saw a small flicker of disappointment, even though he tried to hide it. Julia's control didn't stop at the house. It also extended to Robert. One morning, I saw him getting ready for a meeting. He was wearing a light blue shirt and a striped tie. He looked sharp, as always. But Julia came out, crossed her arms, and looked him up and down. "You can't wear that tie with that shirt," she said in a cold voice. "The patterns clash." Robert frowned, clearly in a rush. "I'm late, Julia." But she didn't give in and stood in front of the door. "Do you want people to think you don't know how to dress?" she snapped in a cutting tone. In the end, he sighed and resignedly went upstairs to change his tie. Julia's outbursts began to become more frequent, almost always for reasons that seemed insignificant. Once I was washing the dishes in the kitchen when I heard her annoyed voice. She was standing, staring intently at the stack of freshly dried plates. She picked one up, pointed to a small scratch, and asked in a tense tone, as if it were something unforgivable, "Who used a fork to scratch this porcelain plate? It looks awful." Robert and I looked at each other without saying a word. I wanted to reply, to tell her it was only a slight scratch, but her cold gaze silenced me. Robert lowered his head and silently wiped the plate again, even though he wasn't at fault. Tensions grew more every day. Robert started coming home late, saying work kept him busy, but I knew he was avoiding conflict. In the evening, he would sit at the table in silence, no longer telling jokes like before. Julia, on the other hand, maintained an impeccable appearance. She dressed elegantly, spoke softly in front of others, but at home she was like a commander, ready to explode if anything didn't go her way. Once, I forgot a sweater on the sofa. Julia picked it up, carefully folded it, and said in an icy voice, "Mum, if we leave clothes lying around, the house loses all its harmony." I apologized, but inside I felt humiliated. It was my house, and I had to apologize for a sweater. The situation reached its peak one night while I was reading in my room. I started hearing shouts from the kitchen, getting louder and louder. I tried to ignore them, thinking that arguments between spouses were normal. But suddenly there was a dry crash that made my heart jump. I rushed downstairs and saw my favorite ceramic vase, the gift from my 20th wedding anniversary, shattered on the floor. The fragments were scattered, like little pieces of my soul. Robert was standing, his fists clenched and his face flushed with fury. Julia was screaming in a high-pitched voice. "You're a mess! You ruin everything from your job to this vase. I can't stand someone as imperfect as you." I froze, unable to believe what I was hearing. Robert looked at her with weariness, almost pleading. "I'm sorry, Julia, I'm just human. Everyone makes mistakes." But in Julia's eyes, there was no forgiveness, only contempt and disappointment. One afternoon, while I was having iced tea on the porch and watching the roses bloom, Julia came out with a paper in her hand. She was smiling, and for the first time, it wasn't her usual forced smile, but a genuine, radiant one. "Mum, I'm expecting a baby." she said, her voice trembling with emotion, extending the test result to me. I read the words on the paper, and my heart began to pound. Tears streamed down my face, but this time they weren't tears of sadness, but of joy. "Really, Julia?" I asked, my voice choked up. She nodded, and for the first time in many months, she hugged me tightly, like a true daughter. That news was like a fresh breeze that dispelled all the tension in the house. Julia changed completely. She was no longer irritable or trying to control every detail. She started smiling sweetly again, just like when she first joined the family. She began reading thick books about pregnancy and baby smiling guides. In the evenings, she would sit in the living room, put on classical music, and say it was good for the baby. "Mum, your grandson will be very smart. Mozart's music helps brain development," she would tell me with eyes full of light. I nodded, feeling the warmth return to my heart. The family rules chart that used to be on the refrigerator had disappeared. In its place, Julia had taped an ultrasound image, a blurry but meaningful picture of the little one growing inside her. Every time I opened the refrigerator, I stopped to look at that photo, imagining my grandson's tiny face. I started dreaming of the days when I could hold him, sing him lullabies, and tell him the stories I once told Robert. I felt hope returning to the house. I was able to go back to my kitchen, the place I had once felt displaced from. One day I prepared chicken soup with rice, the dish my mother used to make for me when I was a child. I cooked the broth carefully, adding a little ginger for warmth, thinking it would be good for Julia. When I carried the bowl to the table, I feared she would reject it again. But Julia smelled the soup, smiled, and said, "Mom, it smells delicious. Thank you so much." She ate with enjoyment and even said it tasted better than in a restaurant. I watched her from the other side of the table, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe this baby would be the bridge, the one that would unite us again. Robert also seemed reborn. He came home earlier. He no longer used work as an excuse to avoid his wife. Every night he would sit next to Julia, put his hand on her belly, and whisper words of love to the son who would soon arrive. "Hello, I'm Dad," he would say softly. "You're coming home to a happy family, I promise." I watched from the slightly open door, seeing Julia smile as she stroked Robert's hair. It was a beautiful, almost surreal scene, and I stood there, with misty eyes and a smile that came naturally. For the first time, I believed everything would be all right, that the past conflicts had only been misunderstandings. But among those days of hope, strange signs began to appear. Julia became obsessive about the idea that the pregnancy had to be perfect. She wanted to have every possible test done, even those the doctor said were unnecessary. Every time she received a result, she would read it over and only calmed down when the doctor confirmed everything was normal. "Mum, I just want to be sure," she told me once. But in her eyes, there was no relief, only a deep worry, as if she feared something she couldn't control. One night, I woke up because I was thirsty. Passing by the living room, I saw a light coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and Julia was standing in front of the mirror, her hand on her belly, staring fixedly at her reflection. I thought she was talking to the baby, as Robert often did. But then I heard her voice, cold, almost authoritarian. "You have to be healthy. You have to be beautiful. You have to be perfect. Do you hear me?" A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the voice of a loving mother, but of someone who demanded, who imposed. I slowly backed away, trying to convince myself that she was just overly anxious, that it was normal to feel that way when expecting a child. But in time, I knew it wasn't just simple worry. The following days, I tried not to think too much. I kept busy preparing things for the baby, buying adorable little outfits, knitting a yellow blanket, the color of the sun, the color of hope. Robert and Julia were also busy, setting up a corner of the house for the new family member. Robert painted the old crib I had used for him with his own hands, and Julia chose new curtains, this time in a soft blue shade, saying it was good for the baby's mood. On the day Julia went into labor, my whole family was at the hospital. Robert held her hand tightly, encouraging her non-stop. "You can do it, Julia. Keep going." I was outside in the hallway, my hands clasped, praying that she and the baby would be okay. After many hours of waiting, a baby's cry filled the air, loud and full of life. The doctor came out smiling. "Congratulations to the family, it's a very healthy boy." Robert burst into tears, hugged me tightly, and ran to the room to see his wife and son. "Mom, I'm a dad," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I followed him, my heart racing, eager to see my grandson for the first time. When I walked in, Robert was leaning over to kiss Julia's forehead, whispering, "Thank you. We have our son now." But Julia didn't respond. She was there, staring fixedly at the baby in the nurse's arms. The smile on her face had frozen, as if time had stopped for her. I followed her gaze and saw it. A small mark, a slight cleft in the baby's lip, a sign of a cleft lip. It was minimal, almost imperceptible, but to Julia it seemed like a tragedy. We named him Ethan, in memory of his grandfather, my husband, who had passed away many years ago. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a gentle voice, tried to reassure us in the delivery room. "The baby has a small congenital cleft lip," she said, smiling as she brought Ethan closer. "Medicine is very advanced nowadays. A small surgery, and he will be perfectly fine." I nodded, relieved to know it was treatable. Robert took Ethan in his arms, held him close to his chest, and tenderly kissed his forehead. "It's okay, son. You're still my boy. I'll help you to be strong and handsome, I promise you." But Julia was different. She remained lying down, with an empty gaze, not responding to Robert's words. When the nurse offered her the baby, she turned her head and murmured in a weak voice, "I'm too tired. I'll hold him later." I tried not to worry, telling myself she had just gone through a difficult labor, that she just needed to rest. But something was stirring inside me, an uneasy feeling, as if something wasn't right. During the days in the hospital, Julia barely touched Ethan. She stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, as if lost in another world. Every time the nurse brought the baby to her to breastfeed, she would say she was tired, or simply shake her head. Robert and I took turns bottle feeding him, preparing the formula, and comforting him when he cried. I looked at him, with his big eyes and his tiny hands clinging to my fingers, and felt immense love. But every time I looked at Julia, I noticed a distance that grew more and more. She didn't look at him, didn't hug him, didn't talk to him tenderly like other mothers do. I tried to talk to her. "Julia, look at him. He's so beautiful." She just nodded, forcing a smile, and turned her face away. When we returned home, the atmosphere became even heavier. Ethan, due to his condition, had a lot of difficulty feeding. He would choke, and he cried more than other babies. His cry was weak, but persistent, like a plea. I spent my days taking care of him, preparing his formula, rocking him with the old songs I used to sing to Robert. But Julia was different. She started neglecting Ethan. Once the baby cried so much he almost lost his voice, and when I ran from the kitchen, I found her in the living room, with headphones on, looking at her phone, as if she didn't hear anything. "Julia, don't you hear the baby crying?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She looked up with a blank expression. "I'm busy, Mum. Please take care of him." I took Ethan in my arms, cradled him, and felt my heart tighten. How could a mother be so oblivious to her own child's crying? At the same time, bad news arrived like a wave. A major partner withdrew their investment from Robert's company, leaving his young venture on the brink of bankruptcy. One afternoon, I was carrying Ethan when I heard the doorbell. Two bank employees, in formal suits and serious faces, were standing at the door, posting a foreclosure notice. "We are very sorry, Mr. Mason," one of them said in a regretful voice. "This is the notice of seizure for a pending loan payment." I froze, holding Ethan tightly, feeling the world crumble beneath my feet. Robert came home shortly after, his face pale and his eyes dark with circles from so many sleepless nights worrying about the company. "Mum, I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice choked. "I didn't want you to have to go through this." I hugged him, trying to comfort him, although deep down I knew that this difficulty was just the beginning. That night, the air in the house was tense, like a rope about to snap. Julia was in the middle of the living room, looking at Robert shut with silent hatred. She laughed, a bitter, cutting laugh. Wonderful. The failed husband, the house about to be lost, and on top of that, a son who isn't perfect. "I gave a son to a loser, didn't I, Robert?" Her words were like knives, piercing my son's heart and mine. He remained still, his hands clenched, not responding. He only lowered his head and murmured, "I'm doing everything I can, Julia. I'll fix it." But in his eyes, I saw that the confidence he once had was gone, replaced by pain and helplessness. Ethan's crying only made things worse, and every time he cried, it seemed to fuel Julia's fury even more. She started pulling away from the child, leaving Robert and me to care for him. One day, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when suddenly Ethan's crying upstairs stopped. A strange, almost unbearable silence filled the house. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed upstairs. The nursery door was slightly open, and I saw Julia standing next to the crib, pulling her hand away from Ethan's face. A red mark remained around his mouth, as if he had been pressed hard. "What are you doing, Julia?" I yelled, trembling, and picked him up. Ethan burst into tears. Luckily, he was fine. Julia looked at me with an unsettling coldness. "He was crying too much. I just wanted him to shut up for a while." I held him tightly, my heart racing. Julia's words chilled my blood. I couldn't believe a mother would speak like that about her own child. From that day on, I completely took over Ethan's care. I couldn't leave him alone with Julia for a single moment. Every night I slept near his room, with the door slightly ajar and my ear attentive to any sound. I was afraid, not just for Ethan, but also for my family. That woman, whom I had once loved like a daughter, now seemed like a stranger to me, with a gaze so cold that I found it impossible to understand her. The situation reached its limit one night when I woke up to get a glass of water. Passing by Ethan's room, I heard a whisper. The door was barely open, and the hallway light illuminated Julia's silhouette next to the crib. She was looking at the sleeping child, and her voice sounded icy. "I wish you had never been born." A shiver ran down my body. I backed away in the darkness, covering my mouth so as not to let out a sob. My heart ached with fear and sadness. I no longer recognized Julia. She had stopped being that charming and kind young woman, and in her place, only someone with a cruelty I couldn't comprehend remained. One night, I was sitting on the porch, finishing the knitted blanket for Ethan, when I heard his weak but persistent crying from the room upstairs. I immediately stood up, ready to go up. but Julia appeared on the stairs. "Mom, leave him. I'll take care of it," she said in a soft voice, but without a hint of warmth. I nodded and returned to my chair, though my heart was restless. A moment later, Ethan's crying grew louder, accompanied by a muffled sound. I ran upstairs and saw Robert holding the child, touching his forehead with concern. "Mom, he's burning up," he said in a shaky voice. I put my hand on the little one's forehead and felt a searing heat under his soft skin. "Call the doctor right now, son," I urged him. But Robert shook his head, his eyes red. "Mum, I don't have any money left for a doctor to come. I'm going. I'm going to the pharmacy for something to bring down his fever." I wanted to stop him, to tell him he shouldn't medicate such a small child on his own, but the desperation in his gaze silenced me. His company had failed, the bank account was empty, and the house we lived in was about to be foreclosed upon. Robert ran out, leaving me with Julia and Ethan, who was crying inconsolably. 15 minutes later, Robert returned with a bottle of fever-reducing syrup. He prepared it carefully, following the instructions, and gave the child small, trembling spoonfuls. But soon, Ethan began to breathe with difficulty. His skin turned pale, and his lips became bluish. I panicked and shouted, "Call an ambulance, quick!" Julia stood motionless, her gaze lost, while Robert ran to the phone. On the way to St. Jude Hospital, I held Ethan tightly, praying non-stop. Julia was sitting next to us, without looking at the child. She turned to Robert and yelled at him in an icy voice. "Idiot! Did you mean to hurt him? This is all your fault!" Robert didn't answer. He just gripped the steering wheel, his eyes filled with tears. In the emergency room, the doctors and nurses worked without rest. I waited in the hallway with my hands clasped, feeling like time had stopped. Robert paced back and forth, murmuring, "Forgive me, Mom. I shouldn't have bought the medicine." I hugged him and tried to calm him down. "It's not your fault, son. The doctors will pull him through." After a few endless hours, a doctor came out with a slight smile. "The boy is out of danger now. It was just an allergic reaction to one of the components of the medication. We'll keep him under observation." I let out a sigh of relief and hugged Robert. It felt as if they had given us back our breath. I looked at Julia, expecting to see the same relief, but she only nodded with a distant look. I said to Robert, "Son, go home and rest. I'll stay with Ethan." But Julia intervened suddenly with a firm voice. "No, Mum. You've done enough. Go home and rest with him. I'm his mother. I'll stay." She took a small container of instant oatmeal from her purse and offered it to me. "Have some before you leave so you don't get cold." That unexpected display of consideration softened me. I thought that maybe, deep down, she still loved my son and just struggled to express it. Robert and I, exhausted after a sleepless night, left the hospital at dawn. When we got home, I lay down, but sleep didn't come. A feeling of uneasiness was oppressing my chest, like a relentless wave. I remembered Julia's look, cold despite her words. I told myself I was imagining things, but the uneasiness wouldn't go away. Finally, I sat up and said out loud, "I forgot my shawl at the hospital." I called Robert. "Son, take me back. I need to get it." Although he was worn out, he nodded, and we took a taxi back to St. Jude Hospital. As soon as I entered the hallway of the intensive care unit, I heard the alarm blare loudly from Ethan's room. I felt my heart stop. I ran toward the sound, pushing through the people. Nurses and doctors rushed into the room, shouting urgent orders. I tried to enter and managed to see Ethan, so small and fragile, convulsing in the bed. The doctors surrounded him, doing everything possible. but their eyes showed concern. Julia was in a corner, crying hysterically, her hands covering her face. "No, my son! Please save him!" she screamed. But her gaze, when it met mine, had something that didn't seem sincere. All the doctor's efforts were in vain. After a while, one of them came out with a somber face. He spoke in a low voice. "We are very sorry. The boy didn't make it. The cause was a sudden reaction to the medication." I stood still, feeling the world collapse. Robert ran toward me and hugged me, crying heartbrokenly. But Julia fell to the floor, pointed at Robert, and screamed, "It was you! You did this to my son!" That accusation was like a direct stab to my son's heart. He didn't say anything, just stood there, with an empty gaze, as if his soul had left his body. 2 weeks later, Julia filed for divorce. She alleged that Robert had been negligent, that his carelessness had caused the loss of Ethan. In the settlement, she obtained almost all the remaining assets: the house, some savings, and even the family heirlooms I cherished the most. I looked at my son, now barely a shadow of the cheerful and ambitious man he had been. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just signed the papers and left the courthouse in silence without looking back. After that, Robert completely fell apart. He locked himself in his room, not speaking or smiling. I would knock on the door, bring him food, but he would just shake his head and murmur in a weak voice, "Mum, I'm sorry. I don't deserve to be a father, or to be your son." Those words, broke my soul. I wanted to hug him, tell him it wasn't his fault, but Julia's guilt and accusations were consuming him day after day. One morning, a year after Ethan was gone, I knocked on Robert's door, as always. There was no answer. Something in me shuddered. I pushed the door open, and the scene took my breath away. Robert lay motionless in bed, his face serene, as if he were sleeping. At the foot of the mattress, an empty blister pack of sleeping pills, some scattered on the floor. I screamed and ran to hug him, but he wasn't breathing anymore. My son, the last light of my life, had decided to follow in Ethan's footsteps, leaving me alone with an impossible pain to describe. From that day on, I've been alive, but in reality, a part of me left with them forever. 7 years have passed since I lost Ethan and Robert, but the wound in my heart is still open. That blurry video, showing the killer injecting something into Ethan's IV, repeats over and over in my mind. How could I not recognize that face? She, Julia, the daughter-in-law I once loved like a daughter, was the one who brought my family to ruin. Dr. Reynolds handed me the thumb drive with a look full of compassion. "This video was recently recovered thanks to an IT specialist who offered to help," he said in a serious voice. "We have already filed the internal report, but the legal process will take a long time. I thought you had the right to know the truth first." I squeezed the thumb drive, hot in my hand, as if it were a burning ember. "Thank you, Doctor," I whispered, my voice broken. I didn't know what I would do with it, but I was clear that I couldn't let this truth be lost. No, not after everything my family had been through. As I left the hospital, the smell of disinfectant still clung to me, bringing back painful memories. I was about to hail a taxi to go home, but a news report on the lobby television made me stop. On the screen, an entertainment channel was talking about the wedding of the century that was about to take place. The camera moved to the bride, and my heart seemed to stop. It was Julia, in a dazzling Chanel dress, next to a middle-aged man, elegantly dressed, introduced as the president of a real estate company. She was smiling, a bright but icy smile, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood motionless, squeezing the thumb drive so hard that I felt my blood boil. She, The one who had destroyed my family was living a luxurious life, about to start a new chapter, as if Ethan and Robert had never existed. I didn't go home. Instead, I took a taxi and gave the driver the address of the luxurious residence mentioned in the news. During the drive, I asked him to stop at a nearby farmer's market. I didn't know why I was doing it. Maybe I needed time to calm down, to prepare myself for what was coming. I went into a fruit stand, pretended to choose some apples, and spoke to the vendor. "Ma'am, whose mansion is that at the end of the street?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The woman, older and kind-faced, replied cheerfully, "Oh, that's Miss Julia's house. She's very beautiful and talented. She's about to marry the president of a real estate company. They say she suffered a lot before, lost her husband and son very young, the poor thing, but at least now life is smiling on her." Those words cut me like a knife. Suffered? Julia had put on a perfect act, posing as a victim to everyone. I thanked the vendor and left the market with a heavy heart. She had taken everything from me, my grandson, my son, and the home full of memories, and yet she lived surrounded by luxury, admired as a strong woman who overcame adversity. I squeezed the thumb drive in my pocket. I felt like it was the only thing keeping me going. When I arrived in front of the majestic mansion, I rang the doorbell with a trembling hand. An employee came out to open the door with a curious look. "I'm an old acquaintance. I need to see Mrs. Julia," I said, trying to remain calm. She nodded and went inside. Moments later, Julia appeared, as dazzling as on television, in a fitted white silk dress and perfectly curled hair. But when she saw me, her smile vanished, as if a cold gust had erased it. She gestured for the employee to leave, crossed her arms, and looked me up and down. "What are you doing here?" she said in a voice so cold it made my skin crawl, without a trace of the politeness of yesteryear. I looked directly into her eyes, trying to keep my voice steady. "I came to talk about Ethan." My words fell like a stone into a quiet lake. Julia let out a sarcastic laugh, but I saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Ethan?" she repeated mockingly. "That's in the past. Your son made a mistake, and he paid for it. What else do you want?" I squeezed the thumb drive hard in my jacket pocket. It felt like it was pushing me to act. I took a deep breath and said slowly, word by word, "I already know the truth, Julia." My words made her pause, though only for an instant. She looked at me with a cold stare, but I didn't back down. "I know what you did at the hospital that night," I continued, calmer than I expected. Julia's gaze hardened for a moment, barely perceptible. Then she regained her composure, and that icy smile returned to her face. "You want to talk?" she said in a soft but cutting voice. "Come in." She opened the gate and motioned for me to enter. I took a deep breath. I felt like I was entering a lion's den. I had already activated the recorder on my phone in my pocket. I knew this confrontation wouldn't be easy, and I had to be ready for anything. Julia's living room was a luxurious space, all in white and silver, so impeccable it felt frigid. Crystal chandeliers, white leather sofas, and a huge abstract painting on the wall. Everything seemed to reflect her personality, perfect, but without an ounce of warmth. She didn't invite me to sit down or offer me water. She remained standing, arms crossed, looking me up and down with contempt. "You say you know the truth?" she asked ironically. "What truth would that be?" I squeezed the thumb drive again in my pocket, feeling it give me strength. I looked her straight in the eye and replied calmly, "I know what you did at the hospital that night. You injected something into Ethan's IV." I waited for a reaction. Fear, denial, anything. But Julia just smiled coldly. She sat down elegantly on the white sofa, crossed her legs, and adopted a confident pose, as if she had everything under control. "Are you going senile?" she said sarcastically. "The hospital reports are clear. The boy didn't survive due to a reaction to the medication. It was your son who gave him the wrong dosage. Who else do you want to blame?" Her words cut me inside, but I didn't let them affect me. I took a deep breath and continued. "And what if I told you someone saw you that night, when you injected the child?" This time I saw her gaze waver, only for an instant, but it was enough to know I had struck a nerve. However, she quickly recovered her air of superiority. "They saw? Me?" she scoffed. "Who would believe you and your supposed witness? A shattered old woman looking for someone to blame. Or me, a woman who lost her son due to her husband's negligence?" She stood up and walked toward me, lowering her voice to a threatening tone. "Don't forget that 7 years have passed. Even if there were witnesses, no one cares now." I took a step back, but not out of fear. I had already lost too much to fear her. "You're wrong, Julia," I said in a firm voice. "The truth is not buried forever, and I have proof. The video from the hospital cameras." I saw her stop, with a flash of panic in her eyes, although she tried to hide it with a forced smile. "Video?" she repeated mockingly. "A blurry recording from 7 years ago? Do you think that will prove anything? I have rebuilt my life from the ruins your son left. I will not let you destroy it." I looked at her, the woman who took Ethan and Robert from me, the one who turned my family into a pile of ruins. In that instant, I wanted to scream, grab her, and force her to admit her guilt, but I knew emotions wouldn't defeat her calculating coldness. Instead, I spoke in a serene but firm voice. "I'm giving you a chance, Julia. Go to the police station on your own and turn yourself in. At least do it for Robert, for the man who once truly loved you." Julia let out a laugh, an icy sound that echoed in the luxurious room. "Turn myself in?" she repeated, as if it were the most absurd thing she had ever heard. "For what? To give up this perfect life? I haven't done anything wrong, Mrs. Eleanor. I only corrected a mistake of nature." That sentence was like a direct stab to the heart. She called Ethan, my little grandson, a mistake. Just because he had a small condition, something completely treatable. I stood still, feeling my blood boil, but I held back so she wouldn't see my pain. She walked toward the door, opened it, and said with disdain, "You may leave and never show up here again." I looked at her, my gaze cold, but with a flicker of concern I couldn't hide. Before leaving, I turned and said in a low but confident voice, "You will no longer have peace, Julia. I swear it on the soul of my son and my grandson." I left the mansion, walking along the cold, cobbled path, but inside me I no longer felt the emptiness from before. The thumb drive and the recording on my phone were like two small flames, burning slowly, giving me the strength to continue. I didn't go back home, where the memories of Robert and Ethan still floated in every corner. Instead, I took a taxi and asked the driver to take me straight to the main precinct. This time I didn't cry. My tears had run dry 7 years ago, when I lost my son and my grandson. Today I had come to demand justice, not just for Ethan, not just for Robert, but for myself too. At the precinct, I asked to speak with the head detective. The duty officer, a young man in an impeccable uniform, looked at me with some pity. Maybe he thought I was just a confused old woman, ready to tell a sad story that no one wanted to hear. But when I placed the thumb drive and the phone on the table and told him they were evidence of a case that happened 7 years ago at St. Jude Hospital, his expression changed. "Wait a moment," he said, and immediately called his superior. I sat on the waiting bench, clutching my old cloth purse, with a mixture of determination and fear. Would what I brought be enough? Would the truth finally come out, after so many years? A while later, I was taken to Detective Gabriella Stone, a woman in her 40s, with a keen gaze and a firm voice. She offered me a seat, poured me a glass of water, and said in a gentle but authoritative tone, "Mrs. Eleanor, tell me everything." I took a deep breath and started from the beginning. The day Robert introduced Julia, with a radiant smile and a bouquet of orchids, up to the tense days when she started controlling my whole family. I told her about Ethan, about the coldness in Julia's eyes when she looked at him, and about that fateful night at St. Jude Hospital. Finally, I recounted the recent confrontation, Julia's icy words in her luxurious mansion. I spoke clearly, omitting nothing, even though every word reopened the wounds inside me. Detective Stone listened in silence, without interrupting, only occasionally writing in a small notebook. When I finished, she inserted the thumb drive into her computer and played the video over and over. Her face grew more and more serious. She frowned when the image of Julia with the syringe appeared on the screen. Then she put on headphones and listened to the recording of my conversation with Julia. Taking them off, she looked at me with a firm expression. "Mrs. Eleanor," she said in a serious voice, "your confession, along with this video, is exactly what we needed. This is the clearest evidence we have." She immediately called several of her subordinates and ordered them to re-verify Ethan's file at St. Jude Hospital. "Send the video and the audio file to the forensics department right now," she said in a decisive tone. "I want everything to be meticulously reviewed." I spent the entire afternoon waiting at the precinct, my heart pounding. Every minute felt like an hour. I thought of Ethan, his innocent smile, and Robert, my son, who had faded away from the pain. I wondered if I was really doing the right thing, if justice would finally be served after so many years. At nightfall, Detective Stone returned with a thick file in her hands. She sat down opposite me and spoke in a low but confident voice. "Mrs. Eleanor, everything matches up. The experts confirmed that the video was not edited and that the voice on the recording belongs to Julia Stone. We found the old hospital files, and there are several strange details in the medical report that went unnoticed before. We will apply for an arrest warrant tomorrow morning." I nodded, feeling as if a huge weight was slipping off my chest. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice breaking. "Thank you for believing me." The next day was Julia's wedding. I knew it from the articles flooding the internet, praising the wedding of the century between a beautiful businesswoman and the president of a real estate group. I didn't go to the church where the ceremony was being held. I didn't want to see her face again. Instead, I stayed in a small coffee shop across from the church, watching silently through the window. I didn't want to witness her downfall for pleasure, but because I needed to see that justice was served, for Ethan and for Robert. Just as the church clock struck 11 o'clock in the morning, the decorated cars stopped in front of the gate. Julia got out of the vehicle in a multi-thousand-dollar wedding dress, smiling radiantly at the journalists surrounding her. She looked like a princess, perfect and haughty. But then 2 patrol cars appeared, cutting through the flash of the cameras. Detective Stone stepped out of the car, impeccable in her uniform, and announced in a firm voice, "Julia Stone is under arrest for her alleged involvement in the death of Ethan Mason 7 years ago." The atmosphere froze. All the cameras, instead of pointing at the groom, turned toward Julia. Her fiancé, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, stood motionless, looking at the detective in bewilderment, and then at Julia. Guests began to murmur. The whispers spread like wildfire. Julia's perfect smile shattered. She panicked, trying to break free from the officers putting handcuffs on her, screaming, "You're wrong! I'm the victim. I just wanted a perfect life." But her voice was lost in the noise of the crowd and the police sirens. From a distance, through the cafe window, I watched as they led her away. My face remained serene, but inside me, something was finally released. For the first time in 7 years, I felt a faint peace. I wasn't happy about her downfall. I was never like that. But I was relieved to know that, at last, the truth had come to light. Ethan and Robert, the people I loved the most, could at least rest in peace. Julia's trial took place a month after her arrest. I didn't attend all the hearings, not because I didn't want to face her, but because I knew the truth was already out. Detective Stone and her team worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence from St. Jude Hospital, from old witnesses, and also from my own recording. When the local newspaper reported that Julia had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, I sat in the old armchair in the living room, reading every word on the front page. I didn't cry or smile. My tears had dried up long ago, since the days I lost Ethan and Robert. But inside me, I felt a kind of relief, as if a long storm had ended and left behind a clear sky. The case became the center of media attention. The newspapers called Julia the demon bride, the perfect mother, with headlines full of drama. The story of a woman who was once seen as a victim was now revealed to be someone cold and cruel. Her wealthy fiancé, the one who appeared next to her under the lights of the wedding of the century, immediately cancelled the engagement. He disappeared from the public eye without giving explanations, as if he wanted to erase any trace of his relationship with Julia. The perfect empire she had built with so much effort crumbled in a single day, leaving her facing the harsh reality inside the four walls of a cell. At the final hearing, I was invited to speak as a family member of the victims. I stood in front of the stand, looking directly at Julia. She kept her head down. Her hair, once perfectly curled, was tangled and without the slightest touch of elegance. I took a deep breath and spoke in a serene but firm voice. My grandson Ethan did not die because of fate or an accident. His life was taken by his own mother, obsessed with perfection. My son, Robert, also died because of injustice and guilt. Today I am not here to seek revenge, but to give back the truth to those I loved. Justice may arrive late, but it is still justice. The entire room fell silent after my words. Some sobs were heard from the stands, mixed with murmurs of indignation, insulting Julia for her lack of humanity. I didn't look at her again. I turned around and left the courtroom, feeling that I was finally free of a burden I had carried for 7 years. As I left, the sunlight shone brightly through the branches of the trees, reminding me of those afternoons when Robert would sit on the porch, peeling apples and telling jokes. I smiled, although my heart still ached. After the trial, I decided to sell the old house that was once my family's home. Every corner, every wall, held memories. The happy days with Robert and my husband, and the years of pain under Julia's control. I couldn't keep living in a place full of ghosts. I moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, with a balcony overlooking a green prairie field. I planted some pots of roses, the same ones that bloomed in my old garden, as a way to keep Robert and Ethan close. Instead of getting trapped in the past, I decided to do something meaningful. One morning, I went to a social support center for children with special needs. I remembered Ethan's look, the small scar on his lip, and I thought I could help other children like him. I signed up as a volunteer, starting with simple tasks, reading them stories, playing games, or helping them eat. At the center, There were children with cleft lips like Ethan, some with Down syndrome, others in wheelchairs. But what touched me the most were their smiles. Imperfect smiles, but full of life and love. Every day at the center, I am surrounded by pure laughter. The children call me Grandma Nara, take my hand, tell me nonsensical stories, or compete to show me their crooked drawings. One afternoon, a girl named Lucy, with a long scar on her lip, just like Ethan's, ran toward me and hugged me. She put a paper flower in my hands, clumsily folded, but with all her heart. "This is for you, Grandma," she said, her eyes shining. I bent down and hugged her, feeling like I was hugging Ethan again, touching a part of him that was still alive. Tears rolled down my cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. I lived 7 years in the darkness of a lie, in the pain of having lost my son and my grandson. But now, among the imperfect smiles of these children, I found the light. I started writing my story, not to talk about the pain, but to share the path to justice and healing. I wrote for Robert, for Ethan, and for all those who are still fighting to get out of their own darkness. I sent my writings to a local newspaper, and to my surprise, they agreed to publish them. Letters from readers began to arrive, telling me that my story had inspired them, that it had restored their faith in justice and hope. One afternoon, as the sun set red over the prairie fields, I sat on the balcony with the photo of Robert and Ethan in my hands. I whispered, "I did it, my loves. Now you are in the light." I looked toward the horizon, where the fields stretched endlessly, and I felt my heart lighter than ever. Justice had been served not only for my family, but also for the values I always defended: truth, love, and compassion. In the smiles of the children at the center, in the letters from the readers, I found the light of my own life, a light I thought was lost forever. Now that everything has calmed down, I understand that justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but about giving a voice back to forgotten souls. Ethan left without being able to say a word. Robert died because of an injustice no one believed. And I, as a mother and grandmother, have lived to tell their truth. Life taught me that keeping silent in the face of evil is also a mistake, and that sometimes a single drop of courage is enough to awaken the sleeping conscience of the world. I didn't get back what I lost, but I found myself, a woman who dared to look darkness in the face to protect the love and honor of her family. Perhaps that is the true meaning of surviving, not just continuing to breathe, but continuing to fight for what is right. The story you have just heard has changed names and places to protect the identity of those involved. We tell it not to judge, but with the hope that someone will listen and reflect. How many mothers are suffering in silence inside their own homes? I really wonder, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you keep silent to maintain the peace, or would you face everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story can become a candle that illuminates the path of others. God always blesses, and I am sure that courage will lead us to better days. Now, on the final screen, I will leave 2 of the channel's most beloved stories. I know they will surprise you. Thank you for sticking with me until this moment.